gospel today comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, the 23rd chapter, beginning with the 33rd verse.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? But we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is the gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. So our gospel today may have come as a bit of a surprise to some of you, especially if maybe you've been coming the last couple weeks and seeing how we're making our way through Luke, and suddenly we have jumped ahead a couple chapters. We have jumped ahead of a lot. The last time we were with Jesus, he was in Jerusalem, but he was still in the temple, and he was teaching, and the leaders were coming and trying to trip him up a little bit by asking different questions, and Jesus was answering them, and then we're here. We've skipped the Last Supper. We've skipped Jesus' arrest and trial. There's a lot that we've skipped to get to this point. And so you may be asking, why did we jump ahead? Why did we jump ahead to this particular reading? And the reason is because today is a special day. Today is Christ the King Sunday. Today is the day where we celebrate the power of Christ. We celebrate the kingdom of Christ. We celebrate his majesty and his ascension to the greater throne. And so we use this text of Jesus being up on the cross. And you may ask yourself, okay, if we're talking about Jesus' power and Jesus' majesty and Jesus' might and his kingdom, why are we using a gospel or a lesson that talks about his death, this low moment? Well, we use this gospel. We celebrate this story. Because it is through that cross, through that death, that Christ shows us his true power. See, the last couple of weeks, we've had Jesus being asked questions, right? He's asked all these questions. He's asked about the divorce idea, that if a woman marries 7 different husbands, who is she going to be married to in the afterlife? They ask about, should we pay taxes? All of these questions. And each time Jesus is asked one of these questions, he doesn't actually answer the question that they asked. Instead, he uses that question as an opportunity to flip things on their head and to give them a greater truth. And in many ways, that's what's happening here in the gospel as well. You may have missed it, but Jesus is being asked a question. Now it seems like it's a rhetorical question and it's meant in a mocking tone, but it is a question. Jesus is asked, hey, if you're the king, why don't you save yourself? If you have all of this power, you've saved others, why don't you save yourself? And Jesus, instead of answering that question, uses it as an opportunity to tell a greater truth. The truth that we are saved. The truth that this death is not the end, that in fact, this death is just the beginning. And that's what Jesus does over and over and over again. He takes these things that we think we understand and he flips them on their head. And it's the conflict of these ideas that are so hard, I think, for us to fully understand, but that is what it means to be a Christian, is to live in this sort of interesting conflict. Because we are at the same time both sinners and saints. Christ is fully human and fully God. It's these two opposite ideas that have to live together in unison. That's what it means to follow Christ, is to live in that new area that is created when two opposite ideas come together. And it happens here because here is the cross. The cross is a manner of execution, a horrible execution. It is dark, it is sad, it is a tragedy. It is death itself. And Christ uses that to give life. Everlasting life. And so that cross then becomes two things. It becomes a sign of Christ's death, but also a sign of Christ's triumph. Because that's how God works in this world. He takes something that we think we know and gives it a greater meaning. He takes those boxes that we create, those columns that we put everything, and smashes them together. And he does this over and over and over again. And we see it again in this story, this wonderful story. He's on the cross, and he has a man on his right side and a man on his left. Two criminals up there being crucified at the exact same time. And one of the things that we do when we listen to a story, when we hear a story, or read a story, is we tend to put ourselves into it. That's a pretty common human reaction to a story. We find someone in the story and we identify with them. And I've talked about this before when we had the prodigal son story, about how when we hear those stories, we identify with one of the characters. Maybe we identify with the son who was lost. Maybe we identify with the father. Maybe we identify with the son who stayed and has always done the right thing. And it's the same thing for this story. We hear this story, and I imagine some of you are starting to identify yourself with someone in this story. Maybe not Jesus, because it's always a little bit hard to identify with Jesus, because it's so different than what we can imagine. But I imagine, at least I know for myself, I hear this story and I think, oh, I can kind of see myself as the good criminal, right? We've got the good criminal and the bad criminal. The one who recognizes what's going on and talks to Jesus, and Jesus says, don't worry, you will be with me. Today, you will be with me in paradise. And that's an easy kind of picture for us to put up, right? We have Jesus in the middle. We've had the good criminal, the one who repents and follows Jesus and is saved. And then we have the bad criminal who doesn't get it. And that's easy for us. We've got good and we've got bad. Black and white, everything's in the right boxes. But in doing so, we miss the power of what God is doing. Because yes, the one criminal derided him and never really saw the truth of what Christ was doing. Whereas the other criminal did. He saw Jesus, he saw who he was, and because he saw who he was, he gained a sense of peace at the end. But Christ dies on that cross, not just for the good criminal. Christ dies on that cross for both of them. Christ dies on that cross for the guards who are mocking him. Christ dies on that cross for the leaders who condemned him. Christ dies on that cross for Pilate, who washed his hands because he was too afraid to take a stand. Christ dies on that cross for everyone. And that newness of life, that victory that he wins is for us all. That's the beauty of what Christ is doing. Now, the good criminal, yes, because he saw it, because he reached out to it, because he had that moment of recognizing what was at stake, who was there saving him, he got to have that comfort. But that death on the cross is for them both. And that's a hard thing, I think, for us to fully wrap our minds around. That this isn't a story of how to earn salvation, of how to put all of our ducks in a row and gain that gift. This is a story of Christ taking the hardest most abrupt, most final thing in the human existence, death itself, and instead using it to give us this free gift of grace and love. To save us, to save all of us. So yes, I know you can easily kind of imagine yourself as the good criminal, but I want you to take a second and imagine yourself as the other one. What must life have to thrown at you that you would be that full of anger and cynicism? What kind of life must this man have lived and had happen to him that on the cross, as he's dying, he still reacts with that much anger, that much pain? It's hard to imagine for a lot of us, but unfortunately, it's not hard to imagine for some of us. To have a life like that, to be filled with that much anger and that much pain. And chances are, at some point in your life, you're going to come across someone who is suffering in that way, who is so lost, all they can see is the darkness. And maybe that someone will be you at some point in your life. It is in that moment that I want you to remember that when Christ died on that cross, he died for us all. He came to save the whole world. And that person who is so full of that darkness, who is so lost, still has the brightness of God's gift for them. And if we can do one thing as Christians, as followers of Christ, as people who know and recognize the gift that we have been given, it is to spread that love. To take those who are so lost, to remind them that they are loved, to tell them maybe for the first time that there is a greater truth. That Christ takes this darkness and this pain and this death and makes it something else. Makes it something to celebrate. Makes it something to rejoice. Because God's kingdom does not come in the form of armies and power and money. God's might, God's love, God's power and grace comes in the form of love. There is no end to that. And so all of us can hear what that second criminal says and know that it's true for us. God, remember us in your kingdom. Hear those words, remember us in your kingdom, and we can hold firm and confident in the answer God gives. You will be with me in paradise. Amen. Our hymn of the day today is Lift High the Cross, hymn number 660, or as projected.